The silence in Hank Everett's cabin seemed to mock him as he sat beside the empty wooden cradle, his calloused fingers tracing the intricate carvings he'd spent months perfecting. Outside, the Montana sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, but inside, shadows crept across the floor of a home that had never known a child's laughter. It was 1878, 3 years since he'd built the cradle with dreams that would never come true. His wife Sarah had died in childbirth, taking their unborn son with her to the grave. The doctor had arrived too late from the nearest town of Willow Creek, 15 miles away. Since then, Hank had thrown himself into building his cattle ranch, working from dawn until dusk, trying to outrun memories that followed him like faithful shadows. At 34, Hank was considered one of the more successful ranchers in the territory. His Double E ranch spanned 800 acres of prime grazing land, with a herd of nearly 300 head of cattle. He employed 4 ranch hands who lived in the bunkhouse near the barn, good men who respected his privacy and his demons. Tonight, like many nights, he found himself sitting beside the cradle after his men had retired. Sometimes he would rock it gently, imagining what might have been. Tonight, he just sat still, listening to the wind moaning through the eaves, a sound not unlike his own heart. A sudden pounding at his door startled him from his reverie. Visitors at this hour were rare, especially with a spring storm brewing. Hank grabbed his Winchester rifle from above the mantel and approached the door cautiously. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough from disuse. "Please," came a woman's desperate reply, nearly drowned by the rising wind. "Please help us." Hank unbolted the door, opening it to find a young woman standing on his porch, clutching a bundled infant to her chest. Her dark hair was wild from the wind, her dress mudded and torn at the hem. Despite the dirt smudging her face, he could see she was beautiful, with striking green eyes wide with fear. "Thank God," she breathed, swaying slightly. "I didn't know if anyone lived here." Before Hank could respond, she stumbled forward. He dropped his rifle against the doorframe and caught her by the elbows, steadying her. "My wagon. Broken axle 2 miles back," she explained, her voice trembling. "I've been walking. The baby." As if on cue, the bundle in her arms stirred and emitted a thin, reedy cry. "Come in," Hank said gruffly, stepping aside. "Storm's coming." The woman stepped into the warm cabin, her eyes darting around uncertainly before settling on the cradle beside his chair. Something in her expression shifted surprise, perhaps recognition of the loneliness that permeated the space. "I'm Lillian," she said. "Lillian Owens, and this is Emma." She adjusted the blanket to reveal a tiny face, pink-cheeked and perfect. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. "Hank Everett," he replied, closing the door against the strengthening wind. "Take a seat by the fire, madam. You look half frozen." Lillian moved to the chair opposite his, the one no one had sat in for 3 years. The baby fussed again, and she gently bounced her, murmuring soft reassurances. "Are you hungry?" Hank asked, moving to the stove where a pot of bean stew had been simmering. "Starving," she admitted. "And I need to warm some milk for Emma if you have any." Hank nodded. "Got fresh milk from the cow this morning." He moved with efficiency around his small kitchen, ladling stew into a bowl for her and warming milk in a small pot. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his back to her. There was a pause before she answered. "West, to Oregon." Something in her voice made him turn. She was staring into the fire, her profile illuminated by the dancing flames. There was fear there and something else, determination, perhaps. "Alone?" he asked. She nodded, not meeting his eyes. "My husband died 6 months ago. Fever took him quick." Her arms tightened around the baby. "I sold everything to make the journey west. My cousin has a place in Oregon, said I could start fresh there." Hank placed the bowl of stew on the small table beside her chair, then handed her a spoon. "I'll hold the little one while you eat." Surprise flickered across her face, followed by hesitation. "I won't drop her," he said, feeling strangely defensive. Lillian carefully transferred the bundled infant to his arms. The moment was awkward. His hands were large and rough, unused to such delicate cargo. But then, Emma settled against his chest, and something inside him shifted, like earth giving way after a long drought. "She likes you," Lillian commented, watching them while she spooned stew into her mouth. Hank didn't respond, too caught in the sensation of the small, warm weight in his arms. Emma stared up at him with unfocused blue eyes, her tiny fingers escaping the blanket to wave in the air. He offered his index finger, and she grasped it with surprising strength. "Strong little thing," he murmured. "She has to be," Lillian said quietly, outside. The storm broke in earnest, rain lashing against the windows and thunder rolling across the hills. Hank glanced up from the baby's face. "You'll stay the night," he said, not a question but a statement. "No sense in trying to salvage your wagon in this weather. Tomorrow I'll send my men to bring it in." Lillian's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you. I don't know what we would have done if we hadn't found your place." Later, after Hank had prepared a bottle for Emma from the warmed cow's milk, and shown Lillian to his bedroom, insisting he would take the chair by the fire, he found himself unable to sleep. The presence of another human being, let alone an infant, in his home after so long alone had unsettled something in him, like stirring the bottom of a still pond. He rose silently and crossed to the cradle. In the faint glow of the banked fire, he ran his hand along the smooth wood of the headboard where he'd carved a scene of mountains and trees. He'd built it with such hope, such certainty that it would cradle his child. Now it stood empty, a monument to loss. The floorboard creaked behind him. He turned to find Lillian standing in the doorway of his bedroom, wrapped in a quilt. "I couldn't sleep," she explained softly. "Too many thoughts." Hank nodded. "Know the feeling." She moved closer, her eyes on the cradle. "You made this," she said. "It wasn't a question." "For my son," he replied, the words rough in his throat. "Never got to use it." Lillian's eyes met his, filled with understanding. "I'm sorry." They stood in silence for a moment, the storm raging outside contrasting with the quiet within. "Where's your husband buried?" he asked finally. "Missouri," she replied. "Along with my parents and my brother, there's nothing left for me there now." "Why Oregon?" she sighed, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "My cousin says it's beautiful, green even in summer, good place to raise a child." She paused. "And it's far from St. Louis. Far from certain people who think a widow with a baby should accept the first offer of marriage that comes her way, regardless of the man making it." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Running from someone," a flush crept up her neck. "Not exactly running, just seeking something better." She met his gaze directly. "Wouldn't you do the same for your child? Go anywhere, do anything to give them their best chance?" The question struck him like a physical blow. What wouldn't he have done for his son had he lived? The answer was simple: nothing. There were no limits to what he would have sacrificed. "Yes," he said simply. Emma's cry from the bedroom interrupted them. Lillian gave him a small smile before turning away. "Thank you again, Mr. Everett, for everything." He watched her go, feeling strangely bereft in her absence. Morning brought clear skies, and the realization that Lillian's problem was worse than a broken axle. Hank rode out with two of his men to find her wagon had been stripped by opportunistic thieves who'd likely been watching her from the moment her axle broke. Her trunks had been ransacked, clothes and keepsakes scattered across the muddy ground. Lillian stood amid the destruction, Emma bound to her chest with a length of fabric, her face ashen but composed. "They took everything of value," she said. The money I'd sewn into my skirt lining is all I have left. Hank surveyed the damage. We'll salvage what we can, bring it back to the ranch. They loaded what remained of her belongings, some clothes, a few books, a silver hairbrush that had been overlooked, into Hank's wagon. The journey back to the ranch was silent, Lillian staring straight ahead, her arms protective around Emma. Back at the cabin, she sat at his kitchen table, defeat evident in the slump of her shoulders. "I can't make it to Oregon now," she said flatly. "Not without supplies, not without a wagon." Hank poured her a cup of coffee. "Willow Creek's got a stagecoach that runs west. Expensive, but it would get you there." She shook her head. "What I have left wouldn't cover half the fare." Her hands tightened around the cup. "I'll need to find work, save up again." "Willow Creek might have something. It's a growing town." Lillian looked up at him, a hint of steel returning to her gaze. "Do you need help here? I can cook, clean, so. I'm stronger than I look. I helped my husband with our farm before he died." Hank hesitated. The thought of having her and Emma in his home stirred equal parts longing and panic. His solitude was his armor, protecting the raw wounds that had never fully healed. "I manage fine on my own," he said finally. Disappointment flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Of course. I understand." He cleared his throat. "But there's a ranch about 5 miles east. The Hendersons. Their cook just left to get married. They might be hiring." Hope brightened her eyes. "Would you be willing to take me there, to inquire?" Hank nodded, surprised by his reluctance at the thought of her leaving. "Tomorrow. It's too late today." That evening, as they ate dinner, Emma lying contentedly in the cradle that Hank had moved to the kitchen, Lillian told him more about her life in Missouri. Her husband, Daniel, had been a kind man who'd worked himself to exhaustion on their small farm. After his death, a neighboring farmer, a widower with 5 children, had pursued her relentlessly, despite her refusals. "He thought I should be grateful for his interest," she said, her voice bitter. "As if being a widow with a child made me desperate enough to marry a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient solution to his problems." "Some men are fools," Hank replied. She looked at him curiously. "You never remarried?" He shook his head, focusing on his plate. "Never saw the point." "Don't you get lonely out here?" The question hung in the air between them. Hank looked up, meeting her gaze. "Always," he admitted, the word feeling like it had been pulled from deep inside him. The next morning they set out for the Henderson ranch. Hank drove the wagon with Lillian beside him, holding Emma. The spring day was perfect, clear blue skies, wildflowers dotting the prairie, birds wheeling overhead. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable. When they arrived, Hank was surprised to find the ranch in disarray. John Henderson, a man in his 60s with a weathered face and a permanent scowl, informed them gruffly that his wife had fallen and broken her hip 2 days prior. "She's laid up in bed, can't move," he said, eyeing Lillian with sudden interest. "Ranch hands need feeding and I'm useless in the kitchen." "You looking for work, you say?" Lillian nodded. "I'm a good cook, Mr. Henderson, and I can help Mrs. Henderson too if she needs it." Henderson scratched his beard. "Pays $15 a month, plus room and board for you and the little one. Got a small cabin out back where the last cook stayed." "That's very generous," Lillian said. "When would you like me to start?" "Today," Henderson replied bluntly. "Got 6 hungry men who have been living on my sorry attempts at coffee and beans since yesterday." Hank felt an unexpected surge of protectiveness. "The cabin, it's in good repair. Proper roof, stove, that works." Henderson gave him a sharp look. "It's sound enough." "Better than sleeping rough, I reckon." Lillian turned to Hank. "Would you mind bringing my things from your place? What's left of them, anyway?" He nodded, his chest tight with an emotion he couldn't name. "I'll be back before sundown." The ride back to his ranch felt longer than it should have. His cabin, when he entered it, seemed unnaturally quiet without Emma's occasional cries or Lillian's soft voice. He gathered her meager belongings, then stood for a long moment beside the cradle, running his hand along its edge on impulse. He loaded the cradle into his wagon alongside her things. She might need it for Emma, he reasoned, ignoring the hollow feeling in his chest. When he returned to the Henderson ranch, he found Lillian in the main house kitchen, efficiently preparing a meal for the ranch hands while Emma slept in a makeshift bed fashioned from a drawer lined with blankets. "You didn't have to bring the cradle," she said when she saw it, her eyes softening. "Thought Emma might sleep better in it," he replied, setting it in the corner of the kitchen. She smiled, the first full smile he'd seen from her. "Thank you. That's very kind." Henderson appeared in the doorway. "Everett, stay for supper. Woman cooks like an angel. Best meal I've had since my Maggie took ill." The meal was indeed excellent: fried chicken, potatoes, and fresh biscuits that melted in the mouth. The Henderson ranch hands, a rough but decent group of men, treated Lillian with respectful appreciation for the food. Hank found himself watching her as she moved around the kitchen, competent and graceful despite her obvious fatigue. Later, he helped her carry her belongings to the small cabin behind the main house. It was basic but clean, with a narrow bed, a table with 2 chairs, and a small stove for heat. "It's perfect," Lillian said, setting Emma in the cradle. "A fresh start." Hank stood awkwardly by the door. "If you need anything, I know where to find you," she finished for him, her smile warm. "Thank you, Hank, for everything," he nodded, unable to find the right words. As he rode home in the gathering dusk, he realized it was the first time she'd called him by his first name. The next few weeks passed slowly for Hank. He threw himself into ranch work with renewed vigor, extending the corral, mending fences that could have waited another season, riding the boundaries of his property until his horse was nearly as exhausted as he was. Anything to keep from thinking about the woman and child 5 miles east. Despite his efforts, he found himself riding toward the Henderson ranch one Sunday afternoon in early June, a basket of fresh strawberries from his small garden strapped to his saddle. He told himself it was merely neighborly. He found Lillian in the garden behind her cabin, Emma sleeping nearby in a basket covered with mosquito netting. Lillian was planting what looked like herb seedlings, her hair tied back with a faded ribbon, her sleeves rolled up to reveal slender forearms browned by the sun. She looked up at the sound of his approach, surprise giving way to pleasure on her face. "Hank, what brings you here?" He dismounted, suddenly feeling foolish. "Brought these," he said, holding out the basket of strawberries. "First of the season." Her face lit up. "Oh. Emma and I haven't had fresh fruit since. Well, since before we left Missouri. Thank you." They sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree while Emma slept on, Lillian asking about his ranch, Hank inquiring about her work at the Hendersons. She was happy enough there, she told him. Mrs. Henderson was recovering slowly but surely, and the ranch hands treated her with respect. "But," Hank prompted, sensing something unsaid. She sighed, running a finger along the edge of a strawberry leaf. "Mr. Henderson's brother arrived last week from Kansas. He's persistent in his attentions." Hank frowned. "Bothering you?" "Nothing I can't handle," she assured him. "Just reminding me of what I left behind." She changed the subject. "Tell me about your cattle. How many calves this spring?" As the weeks passed, Hank found more reasons to visit the Henderson ranch. He brought tools to fix Lillian's leaking roof, fresh eggs from his chickens. A rocking chair he claimed was taking up space in his barn. Each time, he stayed a little longer, often sharing a meal with her and Emma. The baby was growing rapidly, her personality emerging stubborn and curious, with a laugh that could melt the hardest heart. She reached for Hank whenever he entered the cabin, her tiny face lighting up with recognition. "She knows her friend," Lillian remarked one evening as Hank bounced the child on his knee, Emma giggling with delight. "Smart girl," Hank replied, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the summer heat. In late July, Hank arrived at the cabin to find Lillian packing her few belongings into a trunk. Emma was crawling on a blanket on the floor, babbling happily to herself. "You're leaving?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Lillian straightened, pushing a strand of hair from her face. "Mrs. Henderson is fully recovered. She's taking over the cooking again," she hesitated. "And Mr. Henderson's brother proposed marriage yesterday." Hank felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath him. "And you accepted?" "No." Her vehemence surprised them both. "No," she repeated more softly. "I told him I was flattered but not interested. He didn't take it well. Suggested that a woman in my position shouldn't be so choosy." "Where will you go?" Hank asked, his heart pounding uncomfortably. She sighed, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I've saved almost every penny I earned here. It's enough for stage fare to Oregon if I'm careful with what's left for food along the way." "When?" "Tomorrow. The stage leaves Willow Creek at noon." Emma crawled to Hank's boots and pulled herself up to a standing position, clinging to his pant leg. Without thinking, he bent and lifted her, settling her against his shoulder where she immediately began playing with his shirt buttons. "Don't go," he said, the words escaping before he could consider them. Lillian looked at him, her eyes wide. "What?" "Stay," he said, more certain now. "At my ranch, I have plenty of room. Emma likes it there." "Hank," she said gently, "I can't impose on you like that. It's not an imposition." He took a deep breath. "I want you there, both of you." "As what?" she asked quietly. "Your cook, your housekeeper." "As whatever you want to be," he replied honestly. "I just know that when you're not there, the cabin feels wrong. Empty." Lillian stood and crossed to him, taking Emma from his arms and setting her back on the blanket with a wooden spoon to occupy her. Then she turned to face him, closer than she'd ever stood before. "I need you to be clear, Hank Everett," she said, her voice low and serious. "Because I've spent the last 3 months trying not to hope for something I had no right to hope for." He reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wished, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm asking you to come home with me, to make a life with me. I'm asking for a chance to be a father to Emma and a husband to you if you'll have me." Her eyes filled with tears. "I'd given up on finding this again. After Daniel died, I thought that part of my life was over." "I thought the same after Sarah," he admitted. "Never imagined I could feel this way again. Never wanted to until you showed up at my door in that storm." She smiled through her tears. "You were so gruff, standing there with your rifle, looking like you'd rather face a grizzly bear than a woman with a baby." "Never been so glad to be wrong about anything," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Lillian reached up, placing her palm against his cheek. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, we'll come home with you." The next morning, Hank loaded Lillian's trunk into his wagon, secured the cradle carefully beside it, and helped her up to the seat with Emma in her arms. As they pulled away from the Henderson ranch, he felt lighter than he had in years. They were married 2 weeks later by the circuit preacher who came through Willow Creek once a month. It was a simple ceremony in Hank's now their cabin, attended by his ranch hands and a few neighbors. Lillian wore a dress of pale blue calico with wildflowers in her hair. Emma, dressed in a white gown Lillian had sewn from one of her own petticoats, sat solemnly in the arms of Hank's foreman until the moment the preacher pronounced them man and wife. Then, as if understanding the significance, she let out a crow of delight that made everyone laugh. That night, After Emma was asleep in her cradle, now permanently placed in a small room Hank had built off the main bedroom, Hank took his wife into his arms with a tenderness that belied his strength. "I never thought I'd have this again," he murmured against her hair. "A family." Lillian's arms tightened around him. "Nor did I. When I arrived here that night, I was so desperate, so afraid. I thought Oregon was the answer, but it was here all along. You were the answer." As summer gave way to fall and fall to the crisp chill of winter, the cabin that had once echoed with loneliness became a home filled with laughter and love. Emma took her first steps in the kitchen, tottering from Lillian's outstretched hands to Hank's waiting arms, her face alight with triumph. Hank expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom for Emma and another that, Lillian told him with shy pleasure in October, they would need by late spring. Christmas brought a heavy snowfall that blanketed the ranch in pristine white. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth from the fireplace and the oil lamps Hank had splurged on in Willow Creek. Emma, now an energetic toddler with Lillian's green eyes and a mop of dark curls, sat on the floor playing with a carved wooden horse Hank had made for her. "Papa," she said clearly, holding up the toy to him. "Horse." Hank felt his heart constrict with joy. It was the first time she had called him Papa, though Lillian had been encouraging her to do so for months. "That's right, darlin'," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's your horse." Later, after Emma was asleep, curled around the rag doll Lillian had made her, they sat before the fire, Lillian's head resting against Hank's shoulder, his hand gently caressing the slight swell of her belly. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. "Should have given it to you when we married, but it took time to get it made right." He placed a small velvet pouch in her palm. Lillian opened it curiously, gasping when a gold ring set with a small but perfect sapphire slid into her hand. "Hank, it's beautiful," she breathed, examining the intricate pattern etched into the gold band. "Those are mountains," he explained, pointing to the design. "Like the ones I carved on Emma's cradle, meant to symbolize strength, endurance." "Like our love," she said softly, slipping the ring onto her finger beside the simple gold band he'd given her at their wedding. "Exactly so." He kissed her temple. "You and Emma, you saved me, Lil. I was just existing before you came, not really living." She turned in his arms, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "We saved each other then, because I was lost until I found you." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty. Inside, in the warmth of their cabin, Hank held his wife close, listening to her steady breathing and the occasional soft sound from Emma's room. The cradle that had stood empty for so long would soon cradle another child, and the home that had known only silence now rang with the sounds of family. As Lillian drifted to sleep in his arms, Hank thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. A broken wagon axle, a stormy night, a desperate young mother seeking shelter, such small things to have changed the course of 3 lives so completely. The empty cradle had been a symbol of all he had lost. Now, it was a reminder of all he had found, not just a woman to love and a child to cherish, but hope itself, reborn in the most unexpected way.